Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with your host, your teacher, Mr. Ansharsky. Today, we're going to continue Unit 7. We're going to talk about Chapter 10, the start of the Second World War and events going on in East Asia. But your bell work is on the screen right now. What are some characteristics of fascism? How does fascism come to power? What concerns does it seek to address? That's what you should be answering in the bell work. So like I said, this is Chapter 10 of Unit 7. We are going to discuss East Asia and the start of the Second World War. So you should be able to identify and explain, more accurately, the causes and consequences of WWII, specifically in East Asia. You see what I did there? Chapter 9, you had to talk about Europe. Now you're talking about East Asia. And speaking of East Asia, let's look at what is going on over there, so to say, to quote George Cohen. A little bit of a history joke there for all you US history people. Let's first talk about developments in Japan, because like we are seeing in Germany and Italy, we are going to see the rise of authoritarianism within Japan. In particular, we are going to see the dominance of the Japanese military, particularly by the start of the 1930s. The Japanese military is largely going to replace the civilian government. Remember the imperial diet that was founded during the Meiji Restoration. This civilian government largely going to be taken over by the military. We are going to see an absolute dominance of the Japanese military during the 1930s over all aspects of society. This is again an example of totalitarianism. And we'll talk about how this is different from what is going on in Germany and Italy. But we are going to see the rise of a totalitarian state within Japan. We are going to see the absolute dominance of the Japanese military economically, politically, and socially. Indeed, the Japanese military is going to become a key aspect of society in 1930s Japan. We are going to see a culture emerging, one that is encouraged by this very nationalist militarist government, one that is encouraging absolute obedience to the Japanese state and intense Japanese nationalism. And largely, we are going to see the rise of nationalist and military figures as a result of the Great Depression. Again, a similarity between Europe and Japan in this regard. We are going to see an increased demand by these nationalists and the military and big business in Japan, particularly as a result of the Great Depression. And why is that? Well, the Great Depression is going to hurt Japan as an industrial nation, particularly in the reduction of both exports, so manufactured goods made within Japan, rice fields, and silk fields as well. This is going to be greatly reduced during the halting of global trade in the 1930s and the Great Depression. But we're also going to see a reduction in imports, and that's particularly bad for Japan because Japan depends on natural resources such as oil and coal that's not readily available within Japan. So as a result of this reduction of natural resource extraction within the Japanese Empire, we are going to see the rise of people promising to return Japan to its economic glory. And that is particularly why we see the rise of Japanese militarism and nationalism during the Great Depression. We are going to see the creation of a system of government that is dominated by this nationalist military. You can see that symbol right here in the Japanese military's flag, the rising sun right here. It's a very controversial symbol of Japanese imperialism even to this day. But these nationalists, they are going to argue, kind of similar to the Nazis in Germany and the fascists in Italy, they are going to demand that Japan should have economic self-sufficiency. In other words, economic autarky. So the complete self-sufficiency and not reliance on trade with places like the United States, with places like China. And in order to achieve self-sufficiency, you need all of those natural resources yourselves. Therefore, we are going to see the increase, put into overdrive essentially, of Japanese imperialism during the 1930s. And increasingly, we are going to see Japan turn its attention to its neighbor to the west, China. So just kind of some similarities between these two ideologies, I should say, between European fascism, what we're seeing in Germany and Italy, and what we're seeing in Japan. In Europe, in Germany and Italy, and also Spain to a degree, we do have a single dictator figure. We do see that with guys, and I was about to say gals, guys like Francisco Franco in Spain, Hitler in Germany, and Mussolini in Italy. European fascists, they tend to have a sort of scapegoat group to kind of blame in order to come to power. Nazis, of course, their major scapegoat is going to be the Jewish people, but also communists. We'll also see paramilitary organizations within Germany and Italy that we don't really see in Japan. And partially that's because the Japanese military controls the Japanese government. We do not really see a force like the SS or the SA in Japan. There are similarities, however, between these two different ideologies: the use of police terror, of strict authoritarianism, government repression, censorship, all of these things common in both places. There's extreme nationalism and militarism in general in both places. Both places kind of have that feeling of irredentism, that there is quote unquote rightful land that belongs to my country. So we have extremely aggressive foreign policies in both Japan and in these European fascist states. On top of that, we have the use of state propaganda, how to influence a group of people to support an authoritarian government. And both Japan and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and fascist Spain as well, these are places that are extremely hostile to communism. So we have all of this authoritarianism, this militarism within Japan. This is going to be expressed in a very aggressive foreign policy, especially directed against China. And by 1931, we are going to see the invasion of Manchuria. But what is going on leading up to that? Well, remember that Manchuria is a sphere of influence of Japanese businesses, especially Japanese railroads, who dominate infrastructure within Manchuria. However, this is not directly controlled by Japan, and as such, it is subject to the laws, the rules of China. And that's all very well and good when China was divided during the warlord era. But as a result of China's unification through the Kuomintang Party, through the successful nationalist unification of China by 1927, we are going to see a stronger united China. And that's particularly concerning for two reasons. For one thing, a unified China under the presidency of Chiang Kai-shek is particularly threatening to Japan because they can raise a military. They can raise a unified Chinese national military to oppose Japanese expansion. So a unified and strong government can build a unified and strong military. On top of that, a unified government in China means that they could pass tariffs, that they could put taxes on imported goods, meaning Japan would lose a major center of business. And on top of that, it would make things a lot more difficult to get natural resources out of Manchuria. So, in order to not have any of these problems come about, Japan is going to invade Manchuria in 1931. There is a false flag operation that occurs. Basically, a Japanese railroad is going to explode mysteriously. It was the Japanese that set it off. But who's blamed for it? It's going to be the Chinese. So this is used as a pretext for an invasion. And the Japanese military is going to invade. They are going to establish the prefecture, the province of Manchukuo, under the supervision of the Japanese military government. And the invasion of Manchuria is notable really for two reasons, both its effect on Japan and its effect on East Asia as a whole. Because the invasion of Manchuria is not only going to see the complete reorganization of the Japanese government through the dominance of the military. The military absolutely has all power within Japan at this point. They're going to issue press censorship, impose a very strict authoritarian government. Technically, the emperor is still in charge, but really, it's the military that's in charge. So we have this authoritarianism solidified within Japan as a result of the Manchurian incident. But we also are going to see, in many cases, the start of this conflict between Japan and its East Asian neighbors. Some historians consider this event, the Manchurian incident, to be the start of the Second World War, at least in East Asia. And all of this is going to contribute to increasing militarization of Japan. We are going to see Japan acquire natural resources like oil, like coal, like iron, the stuff you need to wage a war. So we're going to see a buildup, an intense buildup of the Japanese military, one that is able potentially to conquer the rest of China. So we see militarization in Japan, we see authoritarianism in Japan, and we also are going to see, in some cases, the start of a Second World War, at least in East Asia. So you should be able to identify similarities and differences between these two types of governments. But all of this is going to happen at the same time as internal developments within China. We're going to turn our attention now to the Chinese Civil War. But what is going on leading up to this Civil War? Well, first, let's define what the Civil War is. Well, it's going to be a period between 1927, there's a bit of a pause during World War II, and then finally ending in 1949. It's a civil war between the nationalists, i.e. the Kuomintang party, the far right, the right-wing party that has unified China, and the Chinese Communist insurgency. So we are going to see a hostility between the nationalists and the communists. That is what the Chinese Civil War is all about. But how did it come about? Because in 1927, we see the successful conclusion of the Northern Expedition. Remember, this was the Kuomintang nationalist campaign to unify China and unite all of these different warlords. So we are going to see the end of the warlord period. Who comes out on top? It's the nationalists, the Kuomintang party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, the president. But as we kind of saw in our last presentation about China, that would have been chapter 7, I believe. Geez, this is a long unit, isn't it? We are going to see the solidification of power under the hands of the nationalists, even though they got a lot of help by the Communist Party. So in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek turns against the communists. He is going to invade the city of Shanghai, which had a significant communist presence, and he's going to outlaw and ban the Chinese Communist Party. So in retaliation for this attack against the communists, we are going to see the Communist Party form a military organization called the People's Liberation Army. This is going to be the communist insurgency that is going to fight against the nationalist government during the Chinese Civil War. It is going to be largely a guerrilla war. The nationalists, they're going to be really stuck in the cities, whereas the communists, they're going to be in the countryside. They're waging surprise attacks against the nationalists. And the People's Liberation Army, this militant wing of the Chinese Communist Party, it is going to be chaired by a certain gentleman that we'll talk about in just a second, Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is going to be the leader of the Communist Party as a political organization from 1927 until his death in 1976. But he's also going to be an instrumental figure in the People's Liberation Army. Remember the Communist Army fighting against the nationalists. Mao is a very important figure in Chinese history, and we will no doubt talk about him more in our next unit. But right now, we're going to focus on his involvement, so to say, in the Chinese Civil War. Because the communists, spoiler alert, they are going to win in 1949, but we need to see how this war is playing out before all of that. Well, it is going to be this struggle, as I said before, between the communists and the nationalists. And largely, there is going to be an intense guerrilla warfare campaign, one that is going to impact civilians in addition to militant combatants. And largely, the war is not only a military conflict, but it is going to be an ideological war over who gets to win the hearts and minds of China's peasant population. Because the nationalists, spoiler alert, they're not going to treat the peasants all that well. We are going to see a very authoritarian regime in place under Chiang Kai-shek against the really everyone living in nationalist China. And largely, this is going to alienate Chinese peasants. Why is that? Well, the nationalists, oftentimes, they'll just go into homes, they'll break into farms and seize what they need without compensation. We are going to see very high taxes put in place on Chinese peasants. And we are going to see this very strict authoritarianism emerge in nationalist China. And one that is not in favor of peasants, obviously, but in favor of large landlords. And if there's one group of people Chinese peasants hate, it's going to be landlords. On the other hand, the Chinese Communist Party is going to capitalize on the the resentment of the Chinese nationalists by trying to make themselves popular with peasants. Really, they are going to do the opposite of what the nationalists do. They will pay for what they buy or what they need from the peasant class. The peasants are going to supply a lot of resources very much needed by the communist insurgency, by the People's Liberation Army. So we are going to see this battle for the hearts and minds of the Chinese peasantry largely being won by the communists. And that is very much going to influence this emerging idea of Chinese communism that is sometimes called Maoism. So this is Mao's interpretation of Marxism, essentially. It is one that stresses the importance of the peasantry in conducting a communist revolution. It is one that believes that a revolution will emerge from the ground up, essentially, that there will be a sort of vanguard party, but there's more people included in this vanguard party. And it is, again, largely made up of the peasants, not the industrial working class. That's the distinction with the Soviet Union and Marxist-Leninism. So really, this is going to be building upon Li Daocao's ideas that we talked about in chapter 7 when we discussed East Asia and the mandate system. So the nationalists not going to be very popular, and the communists are going to be popular. That's basically the rundown there. Maoism is also going to be popular because it's breaking down social hierarchies. It's very much going to be opposed to Confucianism. It is going to be in favor of female and gender equality in general. So by appealing to peasants, by saying they're the important political organization, and by appealing to women, we're seeing the growth of the Communist Party. All the while, this civil war is going on. But the communists are in a very hard position. They are literally stuck between a rock and a hard, well, not literally. They are figuratively stuck between a rock and a hard place. They really are undersupplied. They are outgunned, outmanned, outnumbered, outplanned, boom, boom, boom. We got to make an all-out stand, and we need a left-hand man. Get it? Because they're communists? Okay, I'm hilarious. But all of that to say, the communists are outnumbered. And by 1934, it looks like the nationalists are going to win. It looks like Chiang Kai-shek is going to successfully destroy the communists because the Communist Party and I should say the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, they are going to be pushed back essentially to the mountains of Southeast China. We are going to see this area of China become a communist stronghold. But it's one that's going to be besieged by the nationalists in 1934. And basically, it seems like the communist army is going to be absolutely destroyed by the nationalists. So Mao and the other political and military leaders of the communist army, they are going to plan a massive escape. And they are going to flee the nationalist siege in Southeast China and move all the way up here to the north of China, to the northwest of China, in a place called Shanxi. So this escape is known as the Long March. It is going to be a, well, long march, one that is a 6,000-mile trek from southeast China all the way to northwest China, and is going to essentially save the Communist Party, as I'll say in a second. But it's a very brutal march. It's a very long and arduous march across China. And 90,000 of these PLA guys, they're going to start out in southeast China. And by the time they get to Shanxi, you are going to see a huge population loss of this rebel army against the nationalists. We are going to see starvation. We're going to see mass reprisals against the communists by the nationalists. And it is going to be a very hard trek, but it's a very important one in the history of Maoism, in the history of communism in China. And why is that? Well, for one thing, it's saving the communist army from the nationalist strangle over their territory in southeast China. So we are going to see basically the saving of the communist army as a result of this dastardly and daring escape plan. On top of that, we are going to see the solidification of power in the hands of Mao Zedong as the leader of the Communist Party. And we're also going to see in this very long trek that the communists are coming into contact with peasants. They are spreading their ideas of Maoism and their ideas of Chinese Marxism. It very much is going to lead to more popular support for the Communist Party in spite of the nationalists. But this civil war is very much going to weaken China, and that's going to be very dangerous because Japan is going to seize that as an opportunity to invade the rest of China, not just Manchuria, but the rest of it as well. And that's basically what's going on in the Second Sino-Japanese War. The first we talked about in chapter 1. Well, the Second Sino-Japanese War is going to begin in 1927 when the Chinese are going to be kicked out of key port cities around the coast of China. We are going to see a massive Japanese blockade, and that's going to allow for the Japanese to move beyond Manchuria and invade China. And we are going to see an extremely brutal invasion of China by the Japanese. It is going to be one that we will see a lot of mass execution of civilians, attacks on Chinese women, and particularly the conquest of the city of Nanking, or Nanjing as it's sometimes called, down here in the middle of China. It is going to be an extremely brutal occupation and attack on this key Chinese city. We are going to see mass instances of sexual assault and violence committed against Chinese civilians. The number that's typically held up in the Battle of Nanjing of the sexual assaults alone is 200,000 young girls and women attacked by Japanese soldiers. So it's an extremely brutal occupation. We'll talk about this more in chapter 12. But the impact of the Second Sino-Japanese War is not only going to, of course, negatively impact Chinese citizens, but it's also going to impact Japanese citizens as well. Not only, of course, the kind of trauma of committing these war crimes, but also we are going to see increased authoritarianism in Japan to direct this all-out, quote-unquote, total war. That phrase is going to come up a lot when we talk about the Second World War, the idea of total war, the notion that the whole of society is involved in the waging of a military conflict. So to direct all of this, we are going to see increased coordination by an increasingly authoritarian Japanese military government. We're going to see very strict rationing, very strict conscription laws. Basically, everyone who is a male over the age of 16 is going to be prepared to die for their country, for their emperor. And this is going to be met with international condemnation, all of this invasionary business. There is going to be a official memo by the League of Nations saying, hey, China, or hey, Japan, you can't do this. What does Japan do? They leave the League of Nations. It's that ineffective. So this is going to be met by other kind of forms of international condemnation, particularly in the oil embargo that the Americans will put on the Japanese by 1940. Hopefully this doesn't lead to Japan doing something like, I don't know, bombing a naval base in Hawaii. It will. So there is international condemnation, but it's largely going to be ineffective other than this oil embargo that the Americans have. And the Japanese invasion is going to be met by significant resistance by the Chinese, particularly by both sides of the Chinese Civil War, the nationalists and the communists. So really what goes on? There's going to be basically a pausing of the Chinese Civil War when the Japanese invade. There is going to be a kind of feeling of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, a temporary truce, and to a degree, military alliance is going to be formed between the nationalists and the Chinese communists until the Japanese can be kicked out. However, even though they have a common goal of kicking out the Japanese from China, we are going to see a different styles of campaign being waged by the nationalists and the communists. I shouldn't say the commies. However, it again is going to make the nationalists very unpopular, as we'll see in just a second. They are going to wage, much like they did in the Civil War, a scorched earth policy. They are going to absolutely devastate the Chinese countryside in an attempt to slow the Japanese invasion. We are going to see the intentional burning of farmland. We are going to see the intentional flooding and breaking of dams along the Yellow River. And this is going to have a very negative impact on it will have a negative impact on the Japanese military invasion. It will slow it down. It will succeed in that regard. But it's going to be very unpopular among Chinese peasants, especially those that are going to be homeless as a result of this flooding. About 12 million Chinese people are going to be left homeless by this scorched earth policy that the Chinese nationalists are going to carry out. On top of that, the Chinese nationalists, they are going to continue being very authoritarian, especially in their treatment of peasants, of taking stuff that doesn't belong to them. So we see this mass repression. And again, we also see kind of an alliance between the nationalists and everyone's least favorite group of people, landlords, i.e., by everybody's least favorite, I meant the Chinese peasants. I don't want to say anything else. All right. So we have this mass repression because I rent a place anyway. Because of this mass repression, we are going to see increased support for the communists. That's something to kind of that's a theme of what I'm talking about here. We are going to see this massive, very corrupt war that is being waged by the nationalists. They are taking bribes from nationalists, from nationalist supporters like landlords. They are going to really be in it for themselves and not for the common good of the Chinese communists or of the Chinese people as a whole. But on top of that, the nationalists are going to make themselves even more unpopular by being very mistrustful of the communist campaign. They are going to, meaning the nationalists, they are going to largely avoid crediting any victories with the Chinese communists, even though the communists are going to engage a very successful war against the Japanese, against the guerrilla force, with guerrilla forces against the Japanese occupation. So that's how the nationalists are waging this war. How are the communists doing it? Well, the government that the communists kind of set up, the temporary government that they set up, is largely going to be one that is very popular among peasants. It's going to include things like gender equality. It's going to include things like land redistribution of social welfare and security, social security. Well, it is going to reduce bandit attacks across China. This communist guerrilla campaign led by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. So the communists are going to endear themselves by basically doing everything the nationalists did, by doing the opposite, rather, of what the nationalists did. On top of that, the Communist Party is going to have a very rigid sense of discipline. We are going to see rule breakers, especially those who targeted peasants, be severely prosecuted. And again, this is going to make the Chinese Communist Party extremely, extremely popular among Chinese peasants for their effectiveness in waging a war against against the Japanese. So how did the conflict between Japan and China impact their respective governments? And how is the war impacting civilians? Oh, dang it. Well, that's what you should consider in East Asia. Let's turn our attention now to the road to war in West Europe. Let's talk about events going on from 1933 to 1939. Basically, I'm going to set a year-by-year playbook, so to say, of the different phases of the start of World War II. Well, by 1933, Hitler is going to come to power. Remember, Hitler was a nationalist. He is also a authoritarian fascist. Well, that's kind of it's a repetitive statement right there. But we are going to see the successful rise to power of the Nazis. And remember, the Nazis are largely campaigning against that Treaty of Versailles, which was deeply unpopular among German nationalists. So we are going to see a lot of the key provisions of the League of Nations of the Treaty of Versailles stipulations not being met or just being ignored. We are going to see Germany cancel their reparation payments they were supposed to pay. We are going to see increased militarization, the rebuilding of the German Air Force, the German Army, the German Navy, all against the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. On top of that, Germany is just going to straight up leave the League of Nations. No pretext whatsoever for anybody to condemn us if we just leave this League of Nations. And remember, Hitler's rise to power also is going to be attributed to his ability to convey that idea of German nationalism, especially the national need to acquire territory, or what we'll see later, living space, quote unquote, Lebensraum. So we are going to see Germany set their eyes on potentially taking over key places around Europe that have German populations. In 1935, we are going to see the successful remilitarization of Germany. And largely, this is going to be kind of overlooked to a degree by the rest of the world because in 1935, Italy is going to invade Ethiopia. Remember, one of the last countries on Earth not colonized by the Europeans, or I should say in Africa, not colonized by the Europeans. And we are going to see kind of an alliance emerge between these two fascist states, between the Nazis and between the Soviets, and between the Nazis and the Italian fascists. So the Axis Pact, or the Axis Power, is going to be signed between the Germans, the Italians, and the Germans, the Italians, and Germans. No, the Germans, Italians, and the Japanese. So we have this alliance that's formed. This is going to be they definitely are, the bad guys of World War II, so to say. And on top of that, we are going to see how the Treaty of Versailles is absolutely going to be put down, because all of this time we are going to see the sending of the German military, to occupy land in Germany's border next to France. We are going to see the occupation of the Rhineland in 1936, this area in red on the map, this area between France and Germany. And part of this Treaty of Versailles, one of the kind of minor subclauses was, hey, Germany, no, you can't do that. You can't put a military presence along the border with France, because that's just going to lead to trench warfare when you think about it. However, the Allies are largely, the old Allies, I should say, of Great Britain and France. They are largely not going to do anything about this. They are going to engage in a policy known as appeasement. Appeasement is the foreign policy of countries like Germany, well, of Great Britain and France, so not Germany, of essentially giving Germany what it wants in exchange for, well, no more war. So the problem with appeasement, of course, is that the Nazis, well, they have no incentive to ignore it. But why is appeasement going to be the strategy of choice by European, meaning British and French diplomats? Well, it's really for three reasons. For one thing, there is going to be a fear of causing another world war. Remember that France and Great Britain, these are liberal parliaments. These are places where we are going to see the vote of the people matter. So we don't want to rock the boat too much, baby. So we are going to see this prevention of another world war to be a major reason why we have appeasement. Give the Germans what they want so they won't go to war with anybody. On top of that, we are going to see the appeal of Nazism in its intense opposition towards communism. So the support of the anti-communist character of the Nazi regime is going to be a major reason why the Nazis, or I should say the Germans, it's out of the kind of fear of communism and the idea that Germany is anti-communist under the Nazis that is going to basically see explicit and implicit support for Nazi actions. So let's just let them do what they want. They're a bulkhead against the Soviet Union. They're doing us a service, aren't they? Another final reason is going to be the naive belief in the integrity of diplomatic relations, particularly in the United Nations. So we are going to see this mistreatment, or I should say this policy of appeasement in order to justify, that will have the effect, I should say, of increasing the ability of Germany to expand. So this is a cartoon that is actually, well, I shouldn't say that, is more than likely, probably, maybe going to be on your exam. You should be able to identify what this cartoon is saying, what things is it referencing. Yeah, essentially. So in 1938, we're going to see that policy of appeasement continue yet again after Austria is annexed by the Germans. Basically, there's going to be a huge, massive campaign among Austrians to say, hey, we're ethnically German. We should be a part of your ever-expanding empire. So we are going to see this unification between Germany and Onion over, well, the objections of the League of Nations. We are going to see the Anschluss emerge out of this pairing between the Austrians and the Nazis in Germany. So the Anschluss, the unification of Austria and the absorption of it into the USSR. And largely in response to this, what are the Allies going to do? They're going to continue that policy of appeasement. They are going to take Hitler to the Munich Conference. And at the Munich Conference, we are going to see that basically, under the direction of Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, we're letting the Germans do whatever they want. That is, let me clarify that again. I'm very sorry. So in 1938, we are going to see the Munich Conference. This is a meeting held between the French, British, and the Germans under Hitler. And we are going to see this agreement that's made that Hitler will promise not to invade places like Czechoslovakia. In return for not invading anything, will perhaps ease up on some of the tensions directed against your country. We will allow you to take only certain parts of Czechoslovakia, only the parts that don't speak German. We will let them be free. That's what the, what are they called? That is what the Germans are promising. And again, the major leader of this, what's it called? Of this Munich conference is going to be this gentleman right here, shaking the hand of Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain. So realizing that the Nazis would probably break this agreement no matter what, we are going to see increasingly military preparedness within within places like Great Britain and France. So to protect a potentially another area of so in order to expand the German imperial borders, we are going to see this invasion of Czechoslovakia, of the rest of Czechoslovakia. And as a result of this invasion, we are going to see an alliance form between the British, French, and the Poles. If the Poles were ever invaded in Poland, then guess what? The Germans, they would have two enemies at their doorsteps, the British and the French. So we are going to see plans being drawn up by the Nazis in order to wage a war to acquire Polish territory. And that is something that is kind of what will set off World War II, as we'll see in a second. But we are going to see a non-aggression pact being signed between the Nazis and the Soviets, between the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Molotov, and in Germany, his equivalent, Ribbentrop. So we have a non-aggression pact reach. Hey, USSR, you'll invade half of this mini place, and I'm going to invade the other half. Does that sound fair? That's essentially what is agreed upon at the Nazi-Soviet pact in August 23 of 1941, of 1930. So we are going to see a temporary alliance, or rather, I should say, temporary truce between the communists in the East, in the Soviet Union, and the communists in the, we are going to see this agreement, rather, between these different groups of people in dividing up Poland. So this is going to have the effect of, for one thing, allowing the Germans to focus on the Western Front before they unleash their war within Europe. So by September 1st of 1939, there is going to be an invasion that's set for the country of Poland. In the West, we have the invasion of Poland by the Germans. In the East, we have some land given to the Soviets. But in invading Poland, that is going to bring the involvement of, guess who? The British and the French. So World War II is officially started by September 1st of 1939. This is a very famous political cartoon from the time. It depicts that Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. And it is going to, it's basically showing how both of these major powers are essentially gloating over the dead corpse of what is presumably a child. So you should be able to identify how fascism led to World War II in Italy and in Germany. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for your presence, and thank you very much for your understanding. Have a great, wonderful rest of the day. Young man, there's no need to get down, I said, young man.